The dense woods of Willow Valley were alive with the pulse of nature. The underbrush rustled in the early morning light as small creatures scurried between shadows, and the tall trees whispered secrets in the cool breeze. It was a world both serene and untamed, where every leaf, every footprint had a purpose. Among the creatures that called this place home, none were as well known or as mysterious as Fern, the red fox with the white-tipped tail. Fern had roamed these woods for years, her fur blending with the auburn hues of the fallen leaves in autumn, and her eyes sharp with the intelligence of one who had survived many winters. She had learned the paths of the valley as though they were etched into her very bones, finding shelter in the hollows of ancient oaks and stalking her prey in the dappled light of the forest floor. She was the valley's silent observer, an elusive spirit that seemed to know every inch of her world. To the few human inhabitants of the valley, Fern was a legend. Farmers in the area had long spoken of the fox, noting her uncanny ability to appear when needed and disappear when the world turned against her. Though Fern kept her distance, there were those who swore she protected their crops, keeping away pests and even foiling the occasional poacher. But Fern never stayed too long, and she never allowed herself to be fully known. She was both a part of the valley and apart from it, a solitary figure. One quiet morning, as mist clung to the valley floor and the forest seemed to hold its breath, something felt off. The usual chorus of bird song was muted, the scurry of small feet in the underbrush subdued. Fern, perched atop a low branch, surveyed the valley with an unsettling stillness. Her sharp eyes scanned the woods, looking for movement, listening for the slightest sound that would betray the presence of danger. She knew the valley well enough to sense when something wasn't right. As the hours passed, the tension in the air thickened. Fern moved through the trees, her paws silent against the damp ground. There was something unfamiliar in the scent of the wind, a sharpness that did not belong to the forest, something metallic, almost chemical. The familiar rhythm of the valley had been broken. At the edge of the valley, near the border where the forest met the meadows, an old wooden fence had been knocked down. The remains of it lay scattered across the ground, splintered wood and twisted wire, as if something large had forced its way through. Fern's ears pricked at the sound of distant movement, something heavy, perhaps a human or another large animal, moving in the brush just beyond the tree line. Her instincts kicked in. She crept closer, keeping low to the ground, her every movement calculated. The scent grew stronger as she neared the fence. It was pungent, overpowering, a scent that made her hackles rise. Fern's eyes narrowed, scanning the area. The forest was quiet now, the usual sounds of rustling leaves and chirping insects gone. She stepped forward, her paws barely making a sound, as she reached the clearing just beyond the broken fence. There, in the middle of the open space, was an unfamiliar figure. A large man clad in worn leather and heavy boots crouched over something, a large trap set with meticulous care. Fern's heart raced. The trap had been designed to catch something powerful, something that didn't belong in the valley. The scent, she now realized, was the sharp odor of chemicals, poison, no doubt, intended for the wildlife that roamed these woods. The man had not yet noticed Fern, but she could see the glint of determination in his eyes. He was hunting. The sun had risen higher in the sky, and the heat of the day began to settle over the valley. Fern moved closer to the man, using the thick undergrowth to keep herself hidden. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to escape this danger before it caught up with her. But something deeper inside her stirred. The valley was hers to protect. The creatures who lived here were her responsibility. She would not let this man destroy the balance of the land. With a sudden burst of speed, Fern darted from the cover of the trees, her red fur flashing like fire through the green. She leaped over the trap, narrowly avoiding the poisoned bait, and made her way toward the man. At the last moment, she veered off, crashing through the brush to distract him. The man cursed and stood, his eyes following her quick movements. He wasn't expecting the fox. He had come to hunt something else, something bigger. But now he was focused on Fern, and as he began to chase her through the woods, the chase grew frantic. He moved with a purpose, determined to capture the fox that had slipped past him. As the chase wore on, the sounds of pursuit grew more frantic, the man's heavy steps crashing through the underbrush, breaking branches with every step. Fern's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the heat of the man's presence just behind her, the thundering of his footsteps gaining on her. The valley, once so peaceful, seemed to close in around them. Fern knew this forest better than anyone. She knew the hidden paths, the shadows where she could vanish. She led the man deeper into the woods, using every trick she had learned in her years of roaming the valley. She darted between the trees, her sleek form disappearing and reappearing like a shadow. The man's breath grew heavier, his frustration palpable as he stumbled through the underbrush. But then, as Fern darted toward a familiar thicket, something changed. A low growl sounded from the trees, a deep rumbling sound that froze both the fox and the man in their tracks. Out of the shadows stepped a massive creature, its dark shape looming in the dappled light. A wolf, larger than any Fern had seen before, its eyes glowing with an unnatural intensity. It stood tall and unblinking, its presence an overwhelming force. The man froze, his eyes wide with terror. He had not anticipated this. The wolf growled again, its gaze flicking from Fern to the man. It stepped forward, its muscles rippling beneath its thick fur. With a final defiant growl, it lunged at the man, knocking him to the ground with terrifying speed. Fern watched from the safety of the thicket as the man struggled to free himself. The wolf was swift, its jaws snapping close, but it did not strike to kill. Instead, it held the man down, keeping him trapped in a silent warning. The valley, it seemed, had its own way of keeping its balance. As the wolf released the man and backed away, it turned toward Fern. The fox, still hidden, watched the wolf retreat into the shadows. Its mission completed. The tension in the air slowly faded, the valley's pulse returning to its natural rhythm. And Fern, the silent protector of Willow Valley, slinked back into the depths of the forest, knowing her work was far from over. The valley was safe. Fern moved silently through the underbrush, her paws light against the damp earth. The air was thick with the scent of the forest, the deep, earthy smell of moss-covered trees, the crisp tang of pine needles, and the rich musk of damp soil. But beneath it all, there was a subtle shift, a sense of lingering unease that refused to dissipate. Her fur bristled, but she remained vigilant, her sharp eyes scanning every shadow, her ears flicking at every whisper of movement. The wolf had done its part, but Fern couldn't shake the feeling that the balance of Willow Valley was no longer secure. Something had been set in motion, something larger and more dangerous than even the lone poacher could have known. As the sun sank lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the valley, Fern made her way toward the heart of the forest. This was where she felt most at home, where the trees grew close together, their branches interwoven to form a natural canopy. The sounds of the valley were muffled here, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. In the distance, a faint sound broke through the stillness, a crack, followed by a low, mournful cry. Fern's ears pricked. It was a sound that didn't belong here. The cry was too human, too anguished. She hesitated, her instincts telling her to remain hidden. But something in that cry tugged at her, a reminder of the fragile connection between all creatures of the valley. She padded silently toward the source of the sound, each movement deliberate, careful not to betray her presence. The cry came again, closer now, followed by the soft, desperate rustle of someone moving through the dense foliage. Fern's nose twitched as she caught the scent of the man, the same hunter who had stalked her earlier, but this time the scent was mixed with something new, something wrong. Fern reached the clearing where the man had fallen earlier. There, tangled in the underbrush, was the hunter. His face was pale, his hands clutching his chest in agony. His eyes were wide with fear, staring at something unseen. He was not alone. The wolf stood just behind him, its glowing eyes locked on the man. It didn't move, its posture tense, as though it were waiting for something. The hunter, trembling, slowly raised his hand, as if trying to push the wolf away. But his strength was fading fast. His breath came in shallow gasps. His chest. Fern watched from the edge of the clearing, her heart racing as she tried to understand what was happening. She had seen the wolf's warning earlier, but this felt different. There was a new force at play, something that neither the man nor Fern had anticipated. The wolf let out a low growl, its eyes narrowing. Fern's ears flattened instinctively. She knew this was no ordinary predator's warning. The wolf's behavior was more purposeful, more deliberate. It wasn't hunting for food. It was guarding something. Or someone. Suddenly, the hunter's eyes shifted, locking on something deep within the forest, just beyond Fern's view. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came. His eyes filled with terror, and in that moment, Fern understood. The valley was no longer safe. Something had come to claim it. With a snap of its jaws, the wolf lunged, its powerful body crashing through the underbrush toward the source of the hunter's fear. Fern darted back, slipping behind a tree to remain unseen, her pulse pounding in her throat. Through the trees she saw it, a figure, cloaked in tattered black robes, moving with the grace of something unnatural. The figure's face was hidden in shadow, but its presence was unmistakable, cold and oppressive. It moved toward the clearing where the wolf had pinned the hunter. The wolf retreated into the shadows, its body rigid with uncertainty, its eyes never leaving the figure. The cloaked figure stopped just at the edge of the clearing. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the silence profound and suffocating. The man, struggling to move, stared at the figure with terror. His hands still clutched his chest, blood slowly staining the earth beneath him. The figure raised one long, bony hand, pointing toward the hunter with deliberate slowness, and then with a voice that echoed like the wind through dry branches, it spoke. Not in words, but in intent. A low hum of energy rippled through the air, as if the very forest trembled in response. In that moment, Fern felt the weight of the valley shift. The balance had been tipped, and it wasn't just the man who had trespassed. It was the forest itself. Something ancient, something darker, had returned to lay claim to the land. The wolf, once vigilant and poised to strike, began to retreat, its fur bristling. Fern's instincts screamed at her to run, to flee the valley before whatever this figure was could unleash its wrath. But something kept her rooted to the spot. An overwhelming need to protect the woods she had called home for so long. The figure lowered its hand, its shadow stretching across the earth like a dark tide. It turned toward the forest's edge where Fern stood watching, its eyes, glowing with an unnatural light, locked onto hers. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, and Fern understood. The figure wasn't just here to hunt. It was here to reclaim what had once been its own. As the figure stepped backward into the shadows, the forest seemed to shudder. The temperature dropped, and Fern felt the weight of its gaze upon her. She wanted to flee, but she couldn't. Something deep inside her urged her to stand firm, to protect the valley with everything she had. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The valley was still. The only sound was the soft rustling of leaves as the wind picked up once more. Fern remained where she stood, heart pounding, eyes scanning the forest. She had felt it. Something ancient had awakened in Willow Valley, and now The valley was no longer just hers to protect. The balance had been broken, and Fern, the loyal fox, had to decide whether to face whatever darkness had returned to the forest, or to run and never look back. For the first time in her life, the valley was not hers alone. The last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon as Fern made her way through the trees, her senses heightened, her every step filled with both fear and resolve. The woods had changed, and so, too, had she. Fern's paws tread softly upon the cool earth, her senses alert, scanning the changing shadows as the last light of day vanished behind the towering trees. The chill of night began to creep in, and the air thickened with the sense of something looming in the distance. The valley had always felt like a place of refuge for her, wild, untouched, hers. Now it felt as though the very land had shifted, as if the ancient heart of the forest was pulsing with an unfamiliar rhythm. She had known the woods her whole life. She knew where the fawns slept during the early mornings, where the owls perched in the dead of night, and where the streams wound through the valley like veins, nourishing everything in its path. But now, something had come, something that neither the creatures nor the land could anticipate. Fern paused at the edge of the forest, where the trees parted into a small meadow. The winds had picked up, rustling the tall grasses that swayed like a sea of green. She had heard the calls of other creatures earlier, disturbed, fragmented sounds as if the valley's usual chorus was being muffled by an unseen weight. The other animals had retreated, no longer moving freely in the open spaces. They were hiding, waiting, unsure of what was to come. As Fern moved deeper into the meadow, a low, eerie howl echoed from the depths of the forest. It was not the wolf's cry, nor any animal Fern recognized. It was something different, otherworldly, primal. Her fur stood on end as the howl reverberated through the trees, its tone unnerving, its depth endless. It was as though the howl itself was a call to arms, summoning the creatures of the valley to acknowledge the return of something long buried. The faint sound of movement disturbed the air. Something heavy was shifting through the tall grasses. Fern crouched low, her body pressing against the earth, her sharp eyes scanning the direction of the disturbance. The moon hung low in the sky now, casting silvery beams over the meadow, and she could see the faint outline of a figure moving cautiously toward her. It wasn't the man, it wasn't the wolf, it was something else, a shadow, its movements fluid, almost unnatural. It was not quite animal, yet not entirely human. The figure's silhouette was large, towering, and as it emerged into the moonlight, Fern's heart skipped a beat. It was a creature that shouldn't have existed, its body covered in thick matted fur but with a disturbingly human-like posture. Its face was a grotesque mix of animal and something much darker, eyes that glowed a faint, eerie red, and a mouth filled with sharp, twisted teeth. The creature's gaze locked onto Fern's as it stepped closer, its slow, deliberate steps crunching the grass beneath it. Fern's instincts screamed at her to run, but she stood frozen, unable to tear her eyes from the figure before her. She had never seen anything like it in the valley. It was as if the very fabric of nature had bent, creating something that was never meant to be. The creature halted a few paces away from her, its breathing labored and rasping. Fern could feel the weight of its presence pressing in on her, the air thick with a sense of malice and hunger. The temperature dropped even further, the chill of the night now cutting through the forest like a blade. She could hear the distant whispers of the valley, the rustling of the leaves, but they seemed muffled, drowned out by the creature's unsettling presence. For a long moment, neither moved. The creature's eyes were locked onto Fern, studying her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. It knew her. It knew this valley. And in that moment, Fern realized it wasn't just the balance of the forest that had been disturbed. It was the very essence of the land that was being corrupted. Something old, something deeply woven into the fabric of Willow Valley had been awakened. and this creature was its harbinger.